Hello, this time on Sitrep.
I am announcing a total increase to the Ministry of Defence's budget of £2.9 billion next year.
That's the defence headline from the new government's first budget. But what can it tell us about their long-term plans for the future of the armed forces? We'll get Mike's take, and Professor Malcolm Chalmers will translate the Treasury speak to reveal if there are any devils in the detail. The FT claims it's got the inside track on a significant change at the very top of the armed forces, putting the Chief of the Defence Staff in charge.
It was something of a surprise to David Cameron when I told him that I didn't actually command the single services. He said, surely that can't be right. And I said, no, it's not right in this day and age, particularly as the armed forces are getting smaller all the time.
General Lord Richards tells us why he thinks it's a good idea and reveals how he tried to make it happen when he had the job. And what makes a great British battle commander? We talked to a very familiar author about their new book and podcast series.
Sitrep with Kate Gerbeau and Professor Michael Clarke.
And for the avoidance of all doubt, Mike, that'll be you, won't it? You are the author.
I am, yes, and the book is out this week. It's called Great British Commanders, and we've produced a series of podcasts called Great British Battle Commanders, which looks at 4 or 5 of these particular characters. I look at 34 of them, but we've got podcasts on 5 of them.
Looking forward to talking to you about it in a moment later on. But we've got other work for you first, the budget. First impressions, good, bad, or indifferent news for defence right now?
Well, Kate, somebody was saying last night, they said, if you thought that voting in elections didn't make any difference because they're all the same, this budget will give the lie to that, because this was absolutely a Labour budget. It was the sort of budget that the Conservative Party would not have produced, and you can either like that or not like it. But it is a distinctly Labour budget. However, my first take on the defence side of it is that this is the sort of budget on defence that a Conservative government might have produced, because we're still waiting to see what the government really thinks about defence in terms of the Defence Review coming out next year. And I think we can all agree there's no step change in defence as a result of this budget, even if there is a little bit of good news there. But we're still waiting to see what this government really thinks about defence for the future.
And also to dig into the detail with us on this is Professor Malcolm Chalmers, Deputy Director of the Defence think tank RUSI. Malcolm, great to see you. Thank you for being our budget translator yet again. Can I start with 2 quick fire questions? The Chancellor says she's giving defence an extra £2.9 billion next year. Is that new money? Yes, no, or it's complicated?
Yes, but it is complicated because, of course, we also have inflation, which erodes the real value of that spending. The armed forces will be paid more next year than they are paid this year, and so on. It's also the case that the £59.8 billion for next year is likely to be changed during the year as a result of a whole number of rather complex budgetary adjustments, which I won't bore you with. Probably the most useful number which the budget statement has provided is it said that on their current estimate, defence spending will grow at 2.3% each year on average, starting last year and finishing next year. That 2.3% per annum in real terms, it will mean that the proportion of national income going to defence will go up very slightly.
And that maths you mentioned, that the increase of 2.3% in real terms after inflation, more spending power. Do you think that maths actually does add up? Yes, no, it's complicated.
I think the maths adds up, but of course it's very well short of what would be required to address many of the capability gaps which the armed forces currently have.
Okay, so the details. Are there any devils hidden in the detail there, Malcolm?
I think it's hard to tell until we hear a bit more. I think that it's actually rather in plain sight that the defence budget is growing in real terms, but it's growing at a relatively slow pace, a pace not unlike the pace at which it grew under the last government. And a lot of weight is being placed on the Strategic Defence Review to work out what the MOD's priorities are, and we'll see how that comes out. The SDR should be more or less complete by the time we get to the spending review in late spring next year. But of course, a lot could change for UK defence next week if Donald Trump becomes the president-elect. And that may change the calculus in terms of the pace at which the UK is prepared to get to that 2.5% target. Of course, there's a lot of people out there who are saying that 2.5% of GDP will not be enough either. But right now, it feels like the timetable for getting to 2.5% is quite extended on these current numbers.
And Mike, the Treasury figures seem to suggest that the extra money is more weighted to equipment and less towards day-to-day spending.
Well, yes, capital expenditure rather than current expenditure. The MOD is expected to get its current expenditure under control or keep it under control. But capital expenditure is very important given what we know of the inadequacies of the force at the moment. I mean, it does need more capital expenditure. But, the truth is that while it's in this sort of steady state, we need more of everything because the personnel numbers are too low and personnel housing is not good enough. Everywhere you look in the MOD budget, there are problems. But at the moment, there's not going to be a step change. As Malcolm said, things might change because of world events. But we all agree that defence needs a rather higher priority in the dark future that we seem to be facing, but it's not going to get it yet.
And does any of this give us any indication about the direction of thought in the Defence Review, Mike, that's going on at the moment?
Not really. I think, the review is taking place in its own sort of intellectual space. And again, as Malcolm says, that when the review appears, it will be very closely tied to the forward programme, to the expenditure programme for the next 3 to 5 years. The budget is only the fiscal side of it. So the future expenditure is what really matters. And when we see that, I think there'd be much clearer when we see the Strategic Defence Review in light of the spending review. Then we'll have a much clearer sense as to how much priority the government really will give defence over the next 5 years. That's the critical point. So for now, there's not that many conclusions we can draw from this budget. It'll all depend on what happens in the spring.
Malcolm, how much does it actually constrain the review or give them room for manoeuvre?
It really does constrain the review. The review, from the beginning, John Healey and the government set the parameters for the review. It was going to be a NATO-first review. The nuclear deterrent was going to be sacrosanct. And they must come up with a programme which is affordable within 2.5%. What nobody knows, of course, is the timetable within which that 2.5% is met, which is critically important. The Office of Budget Responsibility, I think, had some useful remarks on that when it said that if the MOD was to get to 2.5 relatively soon, then it would require something like 10 billion extra spending per year compared with staying where we are as a proportion of GDP. And that would have to be paid for from somewhere. And I think that's the critical moment. And indeed, what the budget is showing us for the first time is the revealed preferences of a government. But within departmental spending, the number one priority is the NHS, which is also the biggest spender, and that's squeezing, I think, other departments. So I think there is a concern that will continue, but this is only the first stage in a game. Maybe the only other thing to remark in relation to this division between day-to-day costs and capital costs, the Chancellor has made a focus on increasing capital spending in the government as a whole, which may mean that the MOD is asked to increase there more than resource spending. But resource spending is critically important for day-to-day readiness. If we want forces which are relatively well prepared for unexpected events, then you do need to put that investment into training, into maintaining your equipment. It's all very well buying equipment, but if you're not maintaining it, then it's not much use on the day.
And Malcolm, what about the above inflation pay rise for the armed forces, among other things? How much extra day-to-day spending power does that leave?
Well, that is a very important component of what's happened over the last 2 years, and I think probably next year as well. Over a number of years, the armed forces fell behind comparators in the civilian sector. In the last 2 years, I think that became untenable, and there have been more generous pay rises, but there hasn't been the funding for those pay rises. As a result of that and other trends, over the last couple of years, the Ministry of Defence has had to shift quite a lot of money from capital spending into day-to-day spending. and they will have to continue to do that, I think, if armed forces pay rises continue at the rate they have done, or you will have to reduce the size of the armed forces. And that's a pretty unpalatable trade-off.
OK, Mike, let's talk about school fees. That's another increased day-to-day cost for the MOD, the increase in the allowance that helps pay school fees for some forces families. Those families will still have to pay VAT on their share of the fees, which can be as low as 10 or 8%. Do you think the government has diffused this issue successfully?
Well, we'll see. They may have. I mean, because this was a signature policy for the government, VAT on private school fees, they weren't going to back off it. So they wanted to keep the principle of it intact, because if they made exceptions for the armed forces, then they would be under pressure to make other exceptions. So what they've tried to do is do it the other way round by increasing allowances to offset the extra cost of VAT. So that may have the effect. It will rather depend on how much extra individual families find themselves paying as a result of the policy. But the government was never going to back off the VAT on private school fees policy, I think, because it was so important to it.
Malcolm, the equipment budget, how much extra money is going into that, and what difference can that make?
Well, I think it is a bit hard to interpret that from the budget numbers. It does show that the capital budget is growing by 3.4% per annum in real terms over this 2-year period. But that includes significant growth in the nuclear budget, which is the biggest program we've got right now, an equipment program. And it also includes spending on infrastructure, which is not equipment. So I think it's a bit early to say where we are on that. At the moment, I think the last published equipment plan from the National Audit Office showed that the equipment plan was, the commitments exceeded the resources available by a significant amount, especially in the first 2 or 3 years. Really, the biggest budgetary problems the Ministry of Defence has are over the next 2 or 3 years. And I think we're going to see probably relatively soon efforts by the MOD to try and balance its books for this financial year and next. Once you get to the end of the decade, you have a lot more options. But in the next 2 or 3 years, it's going to be, I think, pretty tough.
And I know that you said that the government hadn't set a date for reaching that 2.5% of spending of GDP spending on defence. But does this budget actually set us on that course, on that path, though?
On my interpretation of the numbers at present, it sets a rate of increase of spending which is a little bit higher than GDP. So in that sense, it does set us on the path towards 2.5%. But if you continue that rate of growth, it's going to take a very long time to reach 2.5%, certainly by the end of the decade, if not later. It's not setting us on a path to rapidly achieve 2.5%.
Malcolm, inside the MOD right now, do you know, or can you give us an educated guess what they'll be feeling about this budget?
Certainly don't know, and it was only yesterday that we got these figures. In my experience, it takes a little bit of time for the Ministry of Defence to fully understand what the numbers are. But I think the reaction will be quite somber. I think the politics of this budget clearly continue to show that the NHS is the number one spending priority, and that reflects the political priorities of the British people. So I think that there'll be a bit of concern that defence is not getting the sort of increase which the MOD would ideally like, which should be one that brought them to 2.5% relatively early. But this is only round one of the debate. We are now, departments across Whitehall are now already preparing for the spending review in the spring and making their cases. And the combination of the Strategic Defence Review, making the case for investment in defence, and the budgetary conversations about the spending review, I think the game's still on for the MOD in terms of getting a clear timetable for getting to 2.5% in the spring budget. It's possible, I think. Certainly, I imagine the MOD will want a clear timetable for getting to 2.5% in the spring budget.
Look forward to round two. Professor Malcolm Chalmers, so good to speak to you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
OK, talking of the Defence Review, it's underway at the moment. The Financial Times has reported that Britain's top military officer, the Chief of the Defence Staff, is set to get significant new powers in what it's calling the most radical structural shake-up in the Ministry of Defence in 50 years. It says the CDS will not only become central to big spending decisions, they will also take command of the three single services and strategic command. The FT reporting appears very confident, but we should note it is not confirmed. But Mike, how would this be different from how it works now? Because a lot of people would assume the CDS already has those powers.
Yes, and of course the CDS doesn't. The CDS, the Chief of the Defence Staff, just presides over the three individual services. And there's been a lot of talk for a long time that the Ministry of Defence needs to be a strategic headquarters itself, rather than just the sort of management hub. And we've been around this before with the PGHQ at Northwood being the strategic headquarters, and then the Levine Review wanted to give more power to the three services over their own budgets, make them more responsible and so on. And in a way, there's been a lot of discussion, and I think the FT is very well informed that we need to centralise this a bit more to make the MOD a strategic headquarters and make the CDS a more strategic post that has some power over spending rather than just presiding over the three services that have the power over spending. We'll see if that turns out to be the case, but certainly there's a momentum in that direction.
Well, let's talk to someone now who understands very well how those top jobs work, or are supposed to work at the moment. General Lord Richards was Chief of the General Staff from 2009 to 2010, and then Chief of the Defence Staff until 2013. Great to see you. Welcome back to Sitrep. From the outside, it might seem odd to have a Chief of Defence Staff who doesn't actually have direct say over the work of the services. Is that really how it works in the current setup?
Well, it's not entirely as it sounds. There's no doubt the Chief of Defence Staff had huge moral authority, and indeed, through the mechanisms that were employed within the MOD, particularly after something called the Levine reforms in 2011, I, by that stage, was CDS. He had more authority than perhaps this measure that's been reported in the FT suggests. But the fact is, he's not a commander of Britain's defence forces. He's the Chief of Defence Staff. And interestingly, other nations, like-minded nations like Australia and Canada, the CDS equivalent is the CDF, the Chief of Defence Force, not the CDS. So there is quite a lot in this, and I think it's an important innovation.
When you were Chief of the General Staff, did you see the Chief of Defence Staff as your boss or the Defence Secretary?
Well, again, good question, Kate. I think it was a bit of both. We had the right, as they do at the moment, to go direct to the Secretary of State, and frequently found ourselves in with him. But at the same time, on a day-to-day basis, because the CDS should have had the ear of the political class, i.e. the Secretary of State and the Prime Minister, being entirely sensible about it, you made sure that you viewed him as your boss too. And I would very rarely, if ever, go to the Secretary of State without first having spoken, in my case, to Sir Jock Stirrup.
And what about when you were Chief of Defence Staff? What did you see your role as being to the single service and strategic command chiefs?
Well, the Levine reforms came along in 2011, as I mentioned a minute ago. I realised, and it was something of a surprise to David Cameron when I told him that I didn't actually command the single services. I was, if you like, a significant primus inter pares, and I had access, in the way I've just said, to the political class. He said, surely that can't be right. And I said, no, it's not right in this day and age, particularly as the armed forces are getting smaller all the time. I felt he should become a commander of defence forces, a CDF, as in the case of Australia.
So what do you make of this reported plan to make the Chief of Defence Staff role more powerful and effectively more senior?
Well, I'm a supporter of it, but with some caveats. First of all, we've got to go back, and this seems minor, but is important in principle. We've got to go back to referring to the headquarters at Northwood not as Strategic Command. It was never the Strategic Command. The Strategic Commander is the CDS, because don't forget, throughout what we're talking about on operations, there was no doubt who the Strategic Commander was. It was only in the run-up to operations that there's a slight doubt about his role in some people's minds. So first thing, let it revert to what it should be, something like Joint Forces Command, but not Strategic Command. Secondly, the CDS has got to be given the mechanisms to make sure that when he ordains something probably very difficult, that will be executed. The problems there will be the single service chiefs pushing back. It'll be interesting to see if they still have right of access to the Secretary of State, and the accounting officer, the permanent undersecretary, he will have a view. So I think the CDS's decisions can't be final. It'll be the basis of the start of a discussion, although he will wield great authority.
And what are the advantages of this plan?
Well, it should be that there's less debate and more action. He's got to line up, or the building has got to line up, something I used to call the ARA principle. That's accountability, responsibility, and authority. In theory, they now will be all melded into one person. That is the CDS. Now, that's a good thing, but it's also a very heavy responsibility. And the people who are beneath him, as I inferred a minute ago, have got to be loyal to the system. Whether they like it or not, they can't be spoilers and obstruct a decision that he has taken. Otherwise, we'll be back at square one.
Are those what the potential disadvantages are then of this proposal?
I think so. One, there'll be a lot of very good reasons why some of his decisions will be fought. You know, is he grounded, and I'm not referring to the current CDS at all, but in principle, is that person grounded in jointry? Is he a strategist? Can he think long and deep beyond the immediate? What are the immediate problems he's got nevertheless to solve? So all that, and on top of that, don't forget, he is the strategic commander, and on operations, the armed forces in the first instance have to answer to his authority. So he's going to be a very busy, I think even busier person than he was even in my day.
So if this reported plan is true, where would it actually leave the single service chiefs? Can they still be called a chief?
Well, they will be chiefs of their own service. And in practice, certainly in my day, I created this Armed Forces Committee, and I was the only representative of the Armed Forces on the Defence Board, chaired by the Secretary of State and attended by mainly civil servants. Later, the Vice Chief joined me because, to be frank, I just wasn't up to doing everything all by myself. So I needed a friend beside me who did some of the more sort of detailed stuff. Because don't forget, we had a few wars on at the same time. So I think it's got to be based on that principle, that around that table, the single service chiefs have got to come to terms with the fact that they are responsible for the execution of policy that will ultimately be laid down by the CDS and not by the Secretary of State. But the Secretary of State and the permanent undersecretary have got to be equally understanding. And I think the proof will be in the pudding. I think all of them will find it very difficult sometimes to accept the CDS's word and will push back. Sometimes that will be fine, they'll reach a new solution, or they'll just turn to the right. Other times there will be very serious and difficult decisions to be taken, and it will effectively be taken out of the CDS's hands again. And that's the risk. So I'm a great supporter in principle, but I think the execution will be difficult.
The entire British Armed Forces amount to a similar order of size as the US Marine Corps. The range of work is greater, though. Is it really efficient to keep the level of separation we have between the services?
Well, it's an old question, Kate. We probably talked about it before. In a way, this bridges that or resolves that problem because over time, the CDS and the people that work for him and the mechanisms he establishes can turn it effectively, not in things like uniforms and things like that, but in terms of execution of defence policy, he will be able to be more like the Commandant General of the US Marine Corps. And I don't think, unless things have changed a bit, maybe they have a little bit, that we aren't pretty joint in the execution of our business as it is. So it's not probably quite such a big problem as sometimes people believe. And of course, there are vital traditions in each of the three services that we do not want to lose because they help fighting power, combat power. People are proud of their uniforms and of their history and of their regiments and of the maritime tradition, so on and so forth. So it's, I think, less of an issue in practice than perhaps people think.
And Canada has a unified armed forces. That's not what's being proposed here, though. But does it offer us lessons for what could work and what would not work for us?
Well, it certainly offers lessons in that, to begin with, they went far too far and sort of all wear the same uniform and the same badges of rank. No one knew who was doing what and what rank they were. You know, that went too far and was quite quickly reversed. I'm sure there'll be some lessons there, but and we will now be more like, as I said earlier, Canada and Australia, as long as we pick out the sensible mechanisms employed by them and ultimately accept that the CDS may be retitled the Chief of Defence Forces, or even, dare we say it, Commander of Defence Forces. If we do that and give him the power and ensure that the single services and the civil service and our political masters give him the responsibility and the authority, and he will be accountable in due course. Now, it's a big step. And I have to say, some officers will not like it because the responsibility will be considerable. But on the other hand, I would say the opportunity will be marvellous too. If I was still knocking around, I, as I said to Lord Levine back in 2011, give me that responsibility and I could make a big difference. So I think there'll be plenty of people like me who say, yeah, bring it on, please.
So in that light, then, just finally, if these reported changes were to come into effect, you would have considered the job, winding the clocks back, if you had your time again?
Absolutely. I mean, it is what Lord Levine and I discussed. And in fact, Lord Levine wanted to do it, but famously, a very senior civil servant said, if you do that, you'll make the CDS the most powerful military figure since Cromwell. Now, no one knew what the hell he was talking about, but it didn't half scupper the plan, I can tell you.
Who was that?
Aha. Well, I think I'll keep that to myself. But he was the second permanent undersecretary at the time. And a good friend of mine, by the way. Look him up.
Okay. General Lord Richards, good to speak to you. Always nice. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Kate. Bye-bye.
Mike, it's interesting that General Lord Richards says he was pushing for significantly increased authority and responsibility more than a decade ago, and David Cameron liked the idea, but it was still blocked.
Well, you know, the thing is, Kate, there's no right answer to this question. There are different ways of organising defence at the top level, and it rather depends on what sort of forces you're talking about, your own forces, what sort of situation you're in. And we're in a situation now of really dark international events out there, so it's very different to the situation of 20 odd years ago. And you've got to organise the top of defence according to what you're facing. And the judgment now is that we've got to be more centralised, we've got to be more strategic, because we can't afford to make mistakes. Our armed forces are too small to allow us much of a second chance. We've got to get it right. And therefore, you've got to take the risk, I think, of a more centralised system. And I think that's what we're probably moving to, a strategic command and a commander of the forces who will have power and financial power to make some clear decisions. It's quite scary stuff, and it's not necessarily what we would have done 30 years ago, but it's what we've got to do now.
So, Mike, does this reported plan in the FT make sense for right now, then?
Personally, I think it does, and it may not come to pass, but I think a lot of the mood music around thinking about the Defence Review is that it will involve quite a significant reorganisation of the authority at the very top. That's the information that I'm getting. As I say, a lot may happen between now and March politically, but that is the trend of events. So I think the FT have got it right. It's certainly consistent with some of the things I've heard.
So finally this week, what does it take to be a great British commander? Well, according to the front cover of Mike's new book, it's leadership, strategy and luck. Great British Commanders is a study of 34 military leaders from Boudica to Bomber Harris. Mike, we've mentioned it a couple of times, haven't we, while you've been writing it? As your other half said, you're going to spend time with your generals upstairs in your study. It's been a labour of love for you, hasn't it?
Yes, it has. I've never enjoyed writing a book as much as I've enjoyed this one. And, some of these people, these 30-odd people, some of them are dreadful people, really dreadful, awful people. But I warm to all of them in their command responsibilities, in looking at how each of them, in their all different ways, approach the issue of command. I felt respect and sympathy, even for the most dreadful of them, as well as for some of them who are admirable characters as well.
That's really interesting. And there are some very famous names in there, like Wellington, some much less well known, like the Empress Matilda. How did you choose who was worthy of inclusion?
Well, they're not necessarily the people that I think were the best commanders. Some of them were very poor commanders. And I find that their stories were interesting. And I think I sort of chose them because I thought they all had a strategic effect in some way. They were all people who, whether they succeeded or failed, had a strategic effect. And there's a sort of an exception in Thomas Cochrane, the Seawolf, this famous frigate commander who was a thorn in the side of the French. He was a brilliant frigate commander, but he was a dreadful commander of naval forces because he couldn't get on with anybody else. And yet, Thomas Cochrane, who was at war with the Navy for most of his life, actually had a huge strategic effect on Latin America. He did more than anyone else to bring 3 Latin American countries to independence in the 1820s. So even he had a strategic effect, albeit not on the United Kingdom.
And what did you want to achieve by putting all of their stories already recorded in history side by side?
Well, I'm writing bad history. I wanted to write bad history. I mean, I'm not a historian, I'm a storyteller. I always say that. And good historians put everybody very much in their own context. They would never judge one historical figure by the standards of a different age. And I try not to do that in looking at these people as individuals. I don't judge them as individuals. I just record what I think of them as individuals. But I do try to compare them in terms of strategy. So this is bad history. I try to look at the strategy of Boudica, for instance, as opposed to the strategy of William the Conqueror, or the strategy of Marlborough and the strategy of Wellington. So I take people from this range of historical eras, and because I'm a defence analyst, not a historian, I'm looking at them from the point of view of their tactics and their strategic grip. So in a way, I'm having fun writing bad history, which is to actually compare people across the eras, across 2,000 years, by a very modern standard of judgment as to how good were they strategically, tactically, as commanders themselves.
Love your modesty, Mike. You've done a special Sitrep podcast series to go alongside the book, visiting significant places for some of your subjects with other experts and enthusiasts. I want to play a little bit of one of them in a moment. Hugh Dowding, where did you go and who did you chat to for that one?
Yeah, we went to Bentley Priory, which was the headquarters of Fighter Command during the Battle of Britain, and Dr. Victoria Taylor, she's the best in the business at the moment on the Luftwaffe, on understanding the Luftwaffe, and she knows the Battle of Britain very, very well. And she and I sat in the office of Dowding, and we talked about Dowding as a man, as a pilot. He wasn't a very good pilot, but his command of Fighter Command, his battle of attrition in the Battle of Britain was very interesting.
Dowding's legacy is that he could always see beyond the end of his nose. He very famously said to Lee Mallory once that his problem was that he couldn't see at the end of his little nose, and Dowding could. He was very much a man that he wasn't just looking into the next month or the next week, he was looking into years. He was looking into this sense of, making sure that night fighters are equipped with airborne radar, with making sure that all of these developments are kept up to date.
So he didn't just win an important battle from this office, he also, you would say, helped shape the nature of the RAF as it stood itself up as an independent air force, the first in the world to be an independent air force.
Yes.
And he shaped its future.
He brought subtlety and nuance and a sense of balance to it because it was so offensively minded. But he had to recognise, and he made sure that he checked his ego and recognised that sometimes Britain could be on the back foot in the future. And how right was he?
And that office, was resonant with history. It wasn't just where he commanded the Battle of Britain, but there's a very famous film, of course, which I think a lot of people will have seen, the Battle of Britain film, which came out in 1969. And Dowding features in that film. Laurence Olivier plays Dowding, and they filmed it in that office. Laurence Olivier sitting at the desk that Dowding sat at, and at the end of the film, the climax of the film is very quiet. Dowding puts his pen down, he walks out of his desk, he goes to the balcony, and he looks up at the sky, and the sky is clear, because this is after the 15th of September. The Luftwaffe aren't coming over on the 16th and the 17th. The sky is clear. And there's the balcony. We sat there, we looked at the office, and there was the balcony, and the sense that was where the film was made. It was kind of reality and entertainment coming together in a very resonant way. We had a great time, loved it.
Mike, Hugh Dowding is a really good example of how you get under the skin of these commanders, who they were as people.
Yes, Hugh Dowding was very interesting because they called him Stuffy Dowding. From being a young man, he was known as Stuffy, and that was his nickname. And yet Stuffy Dowding believed in spiritualism. He believed in fairies, literally, he believed in fairies. He thought they were intrinsic to the growth of plants and that they were the connection to a world of inner goodness that guides this world. And spiritualism was very fashionable among that Victorian generation who fought the First World War. And he believed through spiritualism and the intercession of fairies that he was in touch with his dear fighter boys. He always called them his dear fighter boys. His own son was one of his fighter pilots in the Battle of Britain. His own son, Derek. And he survived the battle and he survived the war. To have your own son fighting in this, to lose pilots at the rate at which he was losing them, and his dear fighter boys, the last thing he wrote before he left the office, he was basically sacked at the end of 1940. And as he left that office that we sat in, the last message he wrote was to his dear fighter boys. That's how he started off, to tell them how proud he was of them. And then he put his pen down, he left the office, and as his successor, Sholto Douglas, was walking in to take over, he said, "Good morning," and walked straight out. And that was it.
I really get a sense of how you kind of really warmed to these characters, whether or not they were nice people or not. And Bill Slim, Mike, I know you're a big admirer. He had quite a sideline going on as well, didn't he?
Yeah. Bill Slim, he was Britain's best tactical commander for the whole of the 20th century. And he built and then commanded, rather like Wellington. He built an army and then he commanded it in victory. The 14th Army, the Forgotten 14th Army as it was called, was Britain's biggest and greatest and most successful imperial army. It was the last imperial army Britain ever created, and it was far and away the most successful. And Bill Slim, tough old Bill Slim, is sort of a real rugged, ordinary, sort of very driven man. He used to write romantic stories for women's magazines. And when he was a young officer, and his family, who lived, he was an Indian Army officer then, and of course the income wasn't very good. He had a family to support, and the only way he could supplement his income, he was a very literate man. He was a great reader, and sitting in the Empire, sitting in India, he wrote stories, romantic stories of adventure and love in the exotic locations of the Empire, and he submitted them to Daily Mail, Pearson's Magazine, Woman's Own. He was a great writer, and he wrote under the name William Mills, which is Slim backwards, Mills, Slim. And so Bill Slim was William Mills, writing romantic stories for women in the 1930s to supplement his income.
Did you know that before you started researching this book?
No, I learned it as I began to look at him, and I've established contact with his family, and I'm hoping to go and see some of these stories. I tried to locate some of them, but you can't get them on the internet. But I'm hoping to talk to his family and through a contact and have a look at these stories, just because I find it so charming, because he was such a well-educated, self-educated man. He was so well-read, whereas a lot of generals were not well-read at all. I mean, they read war, they read battles, they read Caesar's commentaries. But Bill Slim read lots of things. He read poetry and literature, and he was an extraordinarily intelligent, sensitive man who nevertheless was a ruthless, successful commander.
Well, if that has inspired your interest, the book is Great British Commanders. It's by you, of course, Professor Michael Clarke, out now. The first episode of the podcast, Great British Battle Commanders, is also out now, talking Wellington with Bernard Cornwell, author of the Sharp novels.
If nothing else comes out, I share Wellington's admiration for the British soldier. And when he said the brave is the finest, I believe him. And as he said, they get me out of trouble. They did at Waterloo. Yeah. It was the bravery of the average British redcoat that got him through Waterloo. I mean, nothing he did strategically or tactically, except to say to the lads, stay there.
Do you think that's his great legacy? Is that the legacy of Wellington, ultimately? His interesting relationship with his troops, the army that he built?
Yeah, but I still go back to the common sense.
Yeah.
It solved problems for him. And he trusted his soldiers, and we know they trusted him. And I imagine that's still vitally important. If you go into battle today, and sadly we do and probably will, you've got to have faith in the people who are directing you.
And you can find it alongside BFBS Sitrep wherever you get your podcasts, or you can watch on the Forces News YouTube channel. Mike, just a final thought. In writing this book and making these podcasts, what or who has most surprised you?
I think what most surprised me was how close most of these commanders came to death when they were young. Most of them committed acts of gallantry early on, and it makes you wonder about the number of wonderful commanders we might have had who were killed early on in their careers. So, you know, when you're talking about the Plantagenet kings, they had to be warriors, so they had to take their chances. I mean, Henry V took an arrow in the face at the Battle of Shrewsbury, literally an arrow straight in the face, and he broke it off and carried on fighting. Should have killed him, but it didn't. And even, you know, later commanders, Montgomery, I mean, he was badly wounded in 1914, and a man came to try to drag him in from no man's land, and that man was killed, fell across him, and Montgomery lay there for the rest of the day with a dead man on top of him, with more snipers' rounds coming into the corpse that was lying on top of him. And when they dragged Montgomery in later that night, he was so close to death, they dug a grave for him. They didn't think he'd last the night out. And all of them, Harold Alexander, Bill Slim, John Gort, they all were carrying 3 or 4 different wounds from their early campaigns as young lieutenants and captains. And that really did surprise me. It made me think that all of these commanders were lucky to be alive to get to the age and the rank then to command when history called. That was really quite surprising when I look across all 30-odd of them.
It's been great hearing about it, Mike. Thank you so much. And thanks to all of our guests. That is all for now. Professor Michael Clarke and I will be back with another Sitrep next Thursday. Don't forget, the first episode of Great British Battle Commanders is online now, with new ones dropping every Monday through November. For now, though, from me, Kate Gerbeau, thank you for listening. Bye-bye.